The elderly man's hands trembled as he pulled out an envelope. Dr. Phil had heard thousands of confessions in 20 years, but none of them started like this. The 78-year-old guest held up the worn envelope and said, "I can't carry this anymore." Dr. Phil stopped the recording. The Dr. Phil Show. Stage 29 at Paramount Studios. Another Wednesday afternoon taping. The studio was packed. 300 people in the audience, cameras positioned at perfect angles, producers monitoring from the control room, everything running like the well-oiled machine it had become over 2 decades. The guest sitting in the beige chair across from Dr. Phil was Harold Mitchell. 78 years old. Retired postal worker from Columbus, Ohio. Married for 54 years. 3 children, 7 grandchildren. By all appearances, an ordinary man living an ordinary life. Except Harold Mitchell had contacted the show 6 weeks ago with a message that had made its way up the production chain until it landed on Dr. Phil's desk. "I've been living a lie for 50 years. My family doesn't know. I'm running out of time to make it right." The show's producers had done their usual intake interviews. Harold had been vague about the details. Something about a secret from 1974, something that affected his entire family, something he'd never told anyone. The producers assumed it was the typical fare, an affair, a financial mistake, maybe a hidden child. Dr. Phil had seen it all before. Or so he thought. Harold sat in the guest chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He wore a button-down shirt and slacks, the kind of neat, pressed clothing that spoke of a man who still believed in presenting himself properly despite the weight he was carrying. His face was deeply lined, not just from age but from what looked like decades of worry etched into every crease. "Harold," Dr. Phil began, leaning forward in his characteristic pose. "You wrote to us saying you've been carrying a secret for 50 years. That's half a century. That's longer than most people's entire lives. What is it that you haven't been able to tell anyone?" Harold's jaw worked silently for a moment. His eyes, magnified slightly behind his glasses, were already glistening with tears. "Dr. Phil, before I tell you, before I tell anyone, I need you to understand something." "What's that?" "My wife, Margaret. She's watching from the green room. My daughter Jessica is here too. They don't know what I'm about to say. They think I'm here to talk about, I don't know, some minor thing from the past. But it's not minor. And once I say it, I can never take it back. Dr. Phil studied Harold's face. In 20 years of doing this show, he'd developed an instinct for when something was different. When the usual script wasn't going to apply. This was one of those moments. "Harold, are you sure you want to do this here? On television? In front of an audience?" "I have to," Harold said, his voice cracking. "If I don't do it now, with witnesses, with people holding me accountable, I'll take it to my grave. And that would be the biggest mistake of all." Dr. Phil nodded slowly. "All right. When you're ready." Harold reached into his jacket pocket with trembling hands. He pulled out an envelope, not a new one, but something old, yellowed with age, the edges worn soft from what must have been years, decades maybe, of being handled. The paper looked fragile, like it might disintegrate if held too firmly. He held it up at chest level, staring at it like it was both a lifeline and a noose. "In this envelope," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper but caught perfectly by the boom microphones overhead, "is a letter. I wrote it in 1974. 50 years ago. I've carried it with me every single day since then. In my wallet. In my jacket. In my bedside drawer. Everywhere I go, it goes." The studio was completely silent. 300 people holding their breath. The cameras zoomed in on the envelope. "What does the letter say?" Dr. Phil asked gently. Harold's hands shook harder. A tear rolled down his cheek. It says I can't carry this anymore. Dr. Phil has heard thousands of confessions over 20 years, but none of them started like this. A 78-year-old guest pulled out a worn envelope and said, "I can't carry this anymore. Dr. Phil stopped the recording. "Harold," Dr. Phil said, his tone shifting to something more protective, more urgent. "Hold on. Before you open that or tell us what's in it, I need to know, are you safe? Is anyone in danger? Is this something that requires authorities to be involved?" "No," Harold said quickly. "No one's in danger. No one ever was. It's not that kind of secret." "Then what kind is it?" Harold looked directly at Dr. Phil, and in his eyes was an exhaustion that went soul deep. "The kind that changes everything. The kind that means my wife of 54 years married someone she didn't really know. The kind that means my children grew up with a father who was lying to them every single day." Dr. Phil sat back slightly, processing. Then he did something he rarely did. He turned to his senior producer standing just off camera. "Michelle, can you bring Mrs. Mitchell and the daughter to the green room monitor? I want them to see this, but I don't want them on stage yet. Not until we understand what we're dealing with." Michelle nodded and spoke into her headset. "Dr. Phil turned back to Harold. "Talk to me. What's in the letter?" Harold stared at the envelope for another long moment. Then, with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, he carefully opened it. The paper inside looked as old as the envelope, brittle, yellowed, covered in careful handwriting. He didn't read from it. Instead, he looked up at Dr. Phil and said 5 words that would stop the entire production. "My name isn't Harold Mitchell." The studio seemed to tilt. "Dr. Phil's expression shifted from concern to complete focus. "Say that again." "My name," Harold repeated, tears now flowing freely, "isn't Harold Mitchell. It never was. Harold Mitchell died in 1974. And I took his place." Dr. Phil paused mid-sentence. The studio went completely silent. Dr. Phil held up one hand toward the cameras. "Stop. Stop recording." He looked at the control room. "I mean it. Stop the tape right now." The red lights on the cameras blinked off. The control room erupted into confused chatter, but Dr. Phil's authority was absolute. When he said stop, you stopped. He stood up and walked closer to Harold's chair, lowering his voice so only the boom microphones would catch it, but not caring, because this moment had transcended television. "Are you telling me you've been living under someone else's identity for 50 years? Harold nodded, unable to speak, the envelope and letter clutched to his chest like a confession finally freed. "Is that letter what I think it is?" Harold found his voice. "It's the real Harold Mitchell's last letter to his mother. He was my best friend. He died in a car accident in 1974. We looked similar. Same height, same build, same coloring. And I took his identification. I took his life. Because I was running from mine." Dr. Phil crouched down beside Harold's chair, the way he did when something required humanity over showmanship. "Why were you running?" "I was drafted," Harold whispered. "Vietnam. 1974. My number came up. I was 28 years old, and I was terrified. My friend Harold, the real Harold, he'd gotten a deferment. Medical reasons. Bad knee from a football injury. When he died in that accident, I saw a way out. I took his wallet. I took his ID. I became him. I used his social security number to get a job. I used his name to build a life. And I never looked back. Until now. Until now." Harold looked at the envelope again. "This letter was in Harold's pocket when he died. I took it. I've carried it for 50 years. It was supposed to be sent to his mother after the accident, but I couldn't send it. Because then she'd know her son was really dead. And I was pretending to be him." Dr. Phil stood up slowly, running his hand through his hair, a rare moment of visible stress. He looked toward the control room glass where producers were frantically trying to figure out what was happening. "Harold, or whoever you are, do you understand what you're telling me? Identity theft. Falsifying government documents. Draft evasion. These are federal crimes. Crimes that don't have a statute of limitations. I know, Harold said. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm finally telling the truth. I'm 78 years old. I have heart problems. My doctor says I have maybe 5 years left. And I can't die as Harold Mitchell. I can't die as someone I'm not. I need to face whatever comes. I need my family to know who I really am before it's too late. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Dr. Phil turned toward the control room again. Michelle, get legal on the phone. Right now. And get our consulting psychologist down here. This isn't a regular episode anymore. He looked back at Harold. What's your real name? Robert. Robert Hernandez. I was born in El Paso, Texas, in 1946. Harold Mitchell was my best friend from work. We both worked at the same factory in Columbus. When he died, I saw a chance to disappear. To not go to war. To survive. And I took it. Your wife. Margaret. Does she know any of this? No. I met her 3 years after I became Harold Mitchell. She thinks she married Harold. She's never known Robert. Your children? They're Harold Mitchell's children. At least that's what their birth certificates say. But they're not. They're Robert Hernandez's children. They just don't know it. Dr. Phil walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. He looked at the cameras, still off, red lights dark, and then at the audience, who sat in stunned, reverent silence. Folks, Dr. Phil said, addressing them directly, we're in uncharted territory here. I've done this show for 20 years. I've heard confessions that would make your hair stand on end. But this is different. This is a man confessing to crimes that could send him to prison. And he's doing it because he can't carry the weight anymore. He looked back at Robert, not Harold anymore, but Robert. Why now? Why after 50 years? Robert held up the letter again. Because 2 weeks ago, the real Harold Mitchell's sister found me. She's been looking for her brother for decades. She hired a private investigator. They tracked down everyone who knew Harold back in 1974. And she called me. She said she wanted to meet her brother one more time before I died. Oh God, Dr. Phil said quietly. I told her I'd meet her. Next month. In Columbus. And I realized. I can't lie to her. I can't pretend to be her brother. I can't keep doing this. So I wrote to your show. Because I needed help. I needed someone to help me tell the truth. Off camera, Dr. Phil made a choice no producer expected. Dr. Phil stood up again. He walked to the edge of the stage and addressed the audience directly. I need everyone here to understand something. What you're witnessing right now isn't entertainment. This is a man's life. A man who made a terrible decision 50 years ago and has been living with it every day since. And now he's choosing to face the consequences. He turned back to Robert. Your wife and daughter are in the green room. They've been watching this on the monitor. They've heard everything you just said. Robert's face crumpled. They hate me. I don't know what they're feeling. But they deserve to hear the rest of this from you. Directly. Not through a television screen. Dr. Phil gestured to Michelle. Bring them out here. Carefully. Give them the option. But if they want to come out, bring them. 2 minutes later, 2 minutes that felt like hours, the green room door opened. Margaret Mitchell walked out first. She was 76, small and thin, her face showing the shock of what she just witnessed. Behind her came Jessica, their daughter, 49 years old, a middle school teacher, her arm around her mother's shoulders. They walked onto the stage slowly. The audience didn't make a sound. Even breathing seemed too loud. Memo final Eclinier. Robert stood up from his chair, the letters still clutched in his hand. Margaret stopped 3 feet away from him, staring at the man she'd been married to for 54 years as if seeing him for the first time. Who are you? She whispered. My name is Robert Hernandez. he said, his voice breaking. I'm from El Paso. I took your husband's name in 1974 because I was afraid. And I've loved you every day since 1977. That part was never a lie. Margaret reached forward and took the letter from his trembling hands. She read it silently, the real Harold Mitchell's last words to his mother, carried for 50 years by the man who had stolen his identity. Then she looked up at Robert. You should have told me. I know. But you're telling me now. Dr. Phil stepped forward. Robert, you need legal counsel. Immediately. What you've confessed here today has serious consequences. But you also need to contact the real Harold Mitchell's family. His sister deserves to know what happened to her brother. Robert nodded. I know. I'm ready. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Dr. Phil arranged for a criminal defense attorney to meet with Robert immediately after the taping. He also connected Robert with a therapist specializing in identity and disclosure trauma. The show paid for family counseling sessions for Margaret, Jessica, and Robert's other children. 3 months later, Robert Hernandez turned himself into federal authorities. He was charged with identity theft and fraud. At 78, facing his true name for the first time in half a century, he pled guilty. The judge, considering his age, his confession, and the decades he'd spent as a productive citizen, sentenced him to probation and community service rather than prison time. Margaret stayed with him. 54 years doesn't disappear because of a name, she said. The letter was finally delivered to Harold Mitchell's sister. She wept reading her brother's last words, but thanked Robert for finally telling the truth. Some burdens are too heavy to carry alone. Robert Hernandez learned that 50 years too late, but not too late to matter.